My name is Dana Whitlow, and at 34 years old, serving as a logistics officer at Fort Peterson, I realized that the people who shared my blood had turned my decade of military service into a convenient front for a multi-state criminal enterprise. You are our rock, Dana. You have always been the strong one. That is why you will understand why we had to do this, my mother whispered over the encrypted line of her iPhone 15 Pro Max, her voice dripping with that manufactured saccharine sweetness that I had finally learned to recognize as the precursor to a devastating betrayal. The air in my office felt suddenly thin, smelling of ozone from the Xerox Altalink C8170 copier and the lingering scent of the lukewarm Starbucks Pike Place roast sitting in a ceramic mug on my desk. I sat there in my pressed OCP uniform, the silver bars of a captain glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights of the logistics hub, staring at a spreadsheet that did not add up. 4 months, I had been the one coordinating the transport of heavy equipment and surplus supplies, trusting the civilian contractors my brother Marcus had recommended with such glowing enthusiasm. But as I looked at the manifest for a shipment of decommissioned engine parts headed to a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, the weight of the discrepancy hit me like a physical blow. The shipping containers were registered at 28,000 pounds each, but the fuel consumption logs for the 2024 Freightliner Cascadia trucks hauling them suggested a load nearly 10,000 pounds heavier. I am getting ahead of myself, though. To understand how I ended up sitting in a cold office at 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, I have to take you back to the family dinners in our brick colonial home in Alexandria, Virginia. While I was studying for my exams at West Point, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and grit, Marcus was the golden child who could do no wrong. He was the one my parents bailed out of debt 3 times, the one who received a 2023 BMW M4 as a graduation gift for a degree he barely finished, while I was told that my military salary and housing allowance were more than enough for a girl like me. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't need help, the one who would always catch the family if they fell. Now, looking at the digital signatures on the fraudulent customs forms, I saw my father's name disguised under a shell company called North Star Logistics. They weren't just moving engine parts. They were using my security clearance and my overseen routes to move untraceable electronics and high-end luxury goods, bypassing the very inspections I was supposed to enforce. The betrayal felt like a jagged blade twisted between my ribs. I thought about the $350 I sent home every month to help with my mother's supposed medical bills for her chronic back pain, only to realize that money was likely being used to pay the lease on a warehouse I never knew existed. My mind raced through the logistics of their deceit, calculating the sheer audacity of using a United States Army captain as an unwitting mule. The invoices showed payments of $52,000 to a contractor listed as Valerius Holdings, a company that, upon a quick search of the Delaware Business Registry, was founded by my own brother just 6 months ago. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of my steel desk, the cold metal biting into my palms. I wasn't just a daughter to them. I was a strategic asset, a shield they used to hide their greed from the light of day. They had gambled with my career, my freedom, and my honor, all while smiling at me over Thanksgiving turkey and telling me how proud they were of my service. Family is supposed to be the one place where you are safe from the world's predation, but for me, family was the predator. I realized then that family isn't defined by the blood in your veins or the name on your birth certificate. Family is who stays when the truth finally comes out. And as the silence stretched over the phone line, I knew I was standing entirely alone in that office. I have spent 12 long years building a reputation for lethal precision within the United States Army, a life measured not in memories but in 4 a.m. rucks through the humid air of Okinawa and meticulous audits where not a single bolt or cotter pin is left unaccounted for in my logistics manifests. My personal life reflects this rigid discipline as I still drive a 7-year-old silver sky metallic Toyota Tacoma with 142,000 miles on the odometer, a vehicle I maintain with the same religious fervor I apply to a motor pool inspection because I have saved every single cent for a future my family never seemed to care about. While I was sweating through layers of OCPs in the Pacific, managing the movement of millions of dollars in military hardware, my sister ALYSSA, now 31, was living a life of soft edges and unearned luxury in a $3,200 a month art studio in the Pearl District of Portland, a space funded entirely by our parents' dwindling retirement accounts. She spends her days draped in expensive anthropology linens and organic cottons, claiming to be finding her soul while she dabs expensive oils onto canvases that no one buys, while I was shipping heavy crates and calculating fuel burn rates under the scorching sun. The contrast between my existence of steel and accountability and her life of whimsy and financial parasitism has always been a jagged pill to swallow. But I played the part of the dutiful, stoic daughter because that was the role assigned to me by my mother's constant reminders that I was the strong one who didn't need anything. But I am getting ahead of myself, because the real sting didn't come from the disparity in our lifestyles but from the realization that my own meticulous systems were being used to subsidize ALYSSA's bohemian fantasy. As I sat in the dim light of my office at Fort Peterson, the hum of the HVAC system providing a low-frequency backdrop to my burgeoning rage, I looked at a series of unauthorized subcharters linked to my latest shipment of tactical vehicle parts. The digital trail, which I had followed with the persistence of a bloodhound, led directly to a shell company that had been paying for ALYSSA's studio rent and her frequent trips to Sedona for spiritual retreats. My parents hadn't just been draining their own savings to support their golden child. They had been siphoning funds and utilizing my military transport contracts to move high-value commercial goods under the guise of official government business. Every time I cleared a container for transport thinking I was serving my country, I was actually paying for ALYSSA's artisanal coffee and her collection of hand-poured soy candles. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth, a metallic bitterness that no amount of cold Starbucks coffee could wash away as I stared at a scan of a forged signature that looked hauntingly like my own. They relied on my competence to mask their corruption, knowing that a captain with my record would never be the first person investigators looked at if a crate went missing or a manifest didn't quite line up with the weight on the scales. I thought about the $400 I spent last month on a new set of Michelin Defender tires for my Tacoma, a purchase I deliberated over for weeks to ensure it was the best value, while my sister was likely charging a $500 dinner at a Michelin star restaurant to a credit card my father paid off every month. The unfairness of it all isn't just about the money, though the sums are staggering when you add up the years of quiet theft. It is about the total lack of respect for the uniform I wear and the person I have fought so hard to become. Family is supposed to be the bedrock you build your life upon, but I have discovered that my foundation was built on shifting sands and the lies of people who saw my strength as nothing more than a resource to be exploited until it was dry. When the truth finally settles, you realize that the people who claim to love you the most are often the ones who know exactly where to twist the knife to make it hurt the most. The betrayal arrived in a plain, nondescript brown corrugated cardboard box at the administration bench at exactly 9:14 a.m., sitting innocently atop the polished mahogany surface like a ticking time bomb. There was no festive card, no ribbon, and no return address that suggested a friend or a relative, just a thermal-printed shipping label from Blue Glint Logistics, a company I knew had been flagged by the Criminal Investigation Division for systemic customs fraud and international smuggling. My commanding officer, Colonel Miller, a man whose face usually held the immovable stillness of Mount Rushmore, paused mid-stride as he saw the package, his complexion turning a sickly, ashen pale that contrasted sharply with his starch-pressed Army Green Service uniform. "Whitlow, do not touch that box," he commanded in a voice that was low and dangerously steady, his eyes locked on the tracking barcode, "because that is not a gift, that is a career-ending liability sitting in the middle of my office." It wasn't just a box to me anymore. It was a Trojan horse designed to dismantle 12 years of flawless service, and as the specialized military police began their protocols, the contents were revealed to be $45,000 worth of stolen Mesopotamian artifacts and gold filigree jewelry. These items had been shipped directly in my name, using my specific Department of Defense activity address code and my personal military credentials to bypass the stringent border inspections that usually catch such illicit cargo. The cold realization that my own family had used my identity as a sacrificial pawn for their black market dealings felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs, making every breath a jagged struggle. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress of integrity, meticulously tracking every bolt and gallon of fuel in the Fort Peterson motor pool, only to have the people I trusted most turn my own meticulously guarded reputation into a high-speed lane for a criminal enterprise. Colonel Miller stared at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment, his silence more deafening than any shouting match could ever be, while the scent of the industrial floor wax and the sterile metallic air of the command center seemed to amplify the gravity of the situation. I could see the digital manifest on his monitor. A 2024 Peterbilt 579 logistics truck already tracked to a warehouse in New Jersey, the same warehouse my brother Marcus had visited 3 weeks ago under the guise of a business expansion. My family hadn't just stolen my peace of mind. They had orchestrated a scenario where I was the primary suspect in a federal investigation, using the very systems I mastered to facilitate their greed. But I am getting ahead of myself, for the true horror lay in the surgical precision of their deception, knowing that I would be the one to receive the blame while they pocketed the untraceable profits from the sale of these antiquities. While I was worrying about the cost of a new set of tires for my aging Tacoma or sending money home to cover my mother's fabricated medical expenses, they were laughing in their sun-drenched kitchens, moving stolen history across borders using my blood-bought clearance. The contrast between my life of service and their life of predatory opportunism had finally reached a breaking point, leaving me standing in a room full of colleagues who now saw me as a potential traitor rather than a trusted logistics officer. Family is supposed to be the sanctuary where you are shielded from the world's malice. Yet I had learned that blood can be the ultimate camouflage for those who wish to destroy you from within. As the CID agents began their interrogation and the reality of a court-martial loomed like a shadow over my future, I realized that loyalty is a currency my family never intended to pay back, and that true family is not the one who shares your DNA, but the one who doesn't set your life on fire to keep themselves warm. I sat in the cramped, familiar cabin of my 2017 Silver Sky metallic Toyota Tacoma at 1945, the humid Georgia air pressing against the windshield like thick swamp water as the crickets in the treeline of Fort Peterson began their rhythmic, maddening drone. The interior of my truck smelled of old upholstery and the faint, lingering scent of the CLP gun oil I used to clean my service weapon, a stark contrast to the sterile, terrifying silence of the interrogation room I had just exited. On the passenger seat lay a single crumpled white paper napkin from a nearby Waffle House, where I had spent 30 minutes frantically scribbling the cold, hard math of my own destruction in smeared blue ink. 5 years of what my mother called small favors, combined with one expertly forged digital signature on a Class 7 supply manifest, added up to exactly 20 years in the United States disciplinary barracks at Leavenworth. My family never actually saw a daughter when they looked at me. They saw a high-security clearinghouse, a convenient logistical loophole that came with a government-issued seal of approval and a clean record they could exploit until it bled. They had gambled my freedom, my pension, and my very identity just to bail ALYSSA out of yet another failed venture. This time a boutique organic apothecary in Savannah that had collapsed under $58,000 of high-interest debt and poor management. The realization that their love was a calculated lie felt like a physical hollow in my chest. A vacuum where my heart used to be as I stared at the dashboard lights glowing a dull, mocking orange. All those times my father called me his rock, telling me how much he admired my strength and my independence, he wasn't complimenting my character. He was reinforcing the shield they held in front of themselves to deflect the consequences of their own greed. I thought about the $3,000 I had wired to ALYSSA last August for her supposed emergency dental surgery, money I had saved by skipping 3 consecutive oil changes and eating MREs I'd scavenged from the back of the warehouse, only to realize now that the money likely went toward a down payment on a black 2024 Volvo XC60 she couldn't afford to insure. The technical precision of their betrayal was staggering, as they had used my specific login credentials for the Global Combat Support System Army to mask the movement of high-value electronics through my port of embarkation. They knew exactly which buttons to push, both in the system and in my soul, playing on my sense of duty to the family unit while they systematically dismantled my life for a few extra zeros in a hidden Cayman National Bank account. The humid air outside began to turn into a heavy downpour, the fat droplets drumming against the roof of the Tacoma with the sound of 1,000 tiny hammers. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a ghostly white, the leather cover peeling slightly under the pressure of my palms. I wasn't just a logistics officer anymore. I was a casualty of a war I didn't even know I was fighting, targeted by the very people who were supposed to be my safe harbor. In the military we are taught that the person to your left and right is your lifeline, but I had learned the hard way that sometimes the person standing right behind you is only there to make sure you don't see the blow coming. Family is not defined by blood or the history of shared holiday dinners at a table polished with lies. Family is who stands beside you when the sirens start wailing and the truth is laid bare under the harsh glare of a CID spotlight. As I watched the raindrops streak down the glass, blurring the world outside into a distorted mess of gray and green, I knew that the rock they relied on was about to break, and when it did, the landslide would bury every single one of them along with me. I did not pick up the phone to call a therapist to manage the crushing weight of the betrayal. Instead, I dialed the Judge Advocate General's Corps and found myself sitting in the cramped, dimly lit office of Lieutenant Vance at 8:30 the following morning. The room was a claustrophobic sanctuary that smelled of stale espresso from a Jura E8 machine and the dry, vanilla-like scent of aging leather-bound law books that lined the particle board shelves. I placed a heavy, stuffed manila folder onto his cluttered desk, the physical weight of 14 months of archived encrypted emails and meticulously printed bank statements thudding against the wood like a gavel. I looked Vance directly in the eyes, ignoring the way the fluorescent light flickered overhead, and explained that my own flesh and blood had used my 2022 W-2 form and my high-level security clearance to quietly register a shell company named Bloom Designs LLC. We spent the next 3 hours hunched over his Dell Precision workstation, tracing a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led through a series of VPNs until we hit the source. A static IP address registered to my parents' brick ranch-style home in the Ardsley Park neighborhood of Savannah, Georgia. The logs showed a series of unauthorized logins to my personal financial accounts at 2:22 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time when I was deep in REM sleep after a grueling 16-hour shift overseeing the offloading of tactical equipment at the port. But I am getting ahead of myself, for the true horror was seeing the systematic nature of their theft laid out in the cold blue light of a legal monitor. While I was struggling to pay off the remaining $4,000 on my Tacoma's loan and carefully budgeting my best for groceries at the commissary, Bloom Designs LLC had processed over $185,000 in suspicious consulting fees from various defense contractors. My mother, the woman who once taught me that honesty was the only currency that mattered, had been the one to hit the enter key, using my identity to shield ALYSSA's failing lavender-scented lifestyle and my father's gambling debts at the casinos in Biloxi. Lieutenant Vance adjusted his glasses, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to a grim, focused intensity as he realized the sheer scale of the fraud committed against a serving officer. "This is not just identity theft, Captain Whitlow," he whispered while tapping a pen against a printout of a forged signature that looked chillingly identical to the one on my military ID. "This is a calculated infiltration of government systems using your life as the primary sacrifice." The contrast between the person I thought they were and the monsters revealed in these data packets made the air in the room feel like it was vibrating with a low-frequency hum of pure rage. I had spent years thinking I was the lucky one because I didn't need their help, never realizing that my independence was exactly what made me the perfect target for their parasitism. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had stolen the very ground I stood on, turning my pride in my uniform into a weapon they could point at my own chest if I ever dared to question them. Every holiday card they sent, every "I love you" texted after a long deployment, was nothing more than a maintenance check to ensure the shield was still in place and the rock hadn't yet crumbled under the pressure of their lies. Family is supposed to be the one place where the world cannot reach you, but I realized in that stale-smelling office that my family was the one who had opened the gates and invited the enemy inside while I was busy guarding the perimeter. As Vance began drafting the initial report for CID, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks the heat of a Georgia summer. The time for being the strong one who understood their mistakes was over. I was now a logistics officer conducting a final scorched-earth audit of my own life, and I intended to make sure that when the smoke cleared, not a single one of them was left standing in the wreckage of my career. The trap was set for Sunday dinner at our family home in Ardsley Park, an event my mother orchestrated under the guise of celebrating my 34th birthday, though I knew with cold certainty they were only inviting me to gauge whether I had already disposed of the incriminating evidence delivered to my office. I arrived at 1700 hours sharp, intentionally choosing to wear my Class A Army service uniform, a garment that felt like a suit of armor with its stiff polyester wool blend, sharp creases, and the heavy weight of my decorations and silver captain's bars catching the afternoon sun. As I pulled my dusty silver sky metallic Toyota Tacoma into the pristine driveway behind ALYSSA's shimmering black 2024 Volvo XC60, the contrast felt like a physical slap, a visual representation of the decade of sacrifice I had endured while they played house with stolen funds. Walking through the front door, the house immediately hit me with the cloying, suffocating scent of lavender essential oil and a thick layer of hypocrisy that seemed to coat every surface of the expensive mahogany furniture. There were 12 people gathered in the open-concept living room, a crowd that included my parents, Marcus, and several of ALYSSA's new investors, who I now recognized from my JAG research as local socialites she had charmed into funding her latest boutique disaster. My mother approached me with a glass of chilled Whispering Angel rose, her face a mask of maternal pride that didn't quite reach her eyes, which were darting nervously toward my rigid posture and the formal military attire that signaled this was not a casual family gathering. "You look so serious, Dana. It is just a family dinner," she chirped, her voice hitting that high melodic note she used when she was lying through her teeth about the cost of her new Nordstrom wardrobe. I stood there, refusing the wine, my hands clasped behind my back in a parade rest that felt more natural than a hug ever could in this house of mirrors. Alyssa was across the room, draped in an ivory anthropology silk wrap that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, holding court with a group of women and laughing about her upcoming soul-searching retreat to Tulum, a trip I knew was being funded by the Bloom Designs LLC account. Every laugh from her mouth sounded like the scratching of a diamond on glass, a reminder that my career and my freedom were being traded for her artisanal lifestyle and my father's gambling debts. I looked around the room at the crown molding, the hand-knotted Persian rugs, and the framed photos of our family vacations to Hilton Head, realizing that every luxury I saw was a fruit from a poisonous tree. They had sat at this very table, perhaps using the same silver-plated cutlery currently being laid out, and discussed how to use my Department of Defense credentials to move black market artifacts through the Newark port. My father caught my gaze from the hallway, his expression flickering with a brief moment of calculation as he adjusted his gold Rolex, a watch I suspected was bought with the $45,000 worth of stolen Mesopotamian gold currently sitting in a CID evidence locker. The injustice of it was a searing heat in my veins, but I remained as cold and impenetrable as the brass buttons on my jacket, watching them celebrate a life built on the bones of my reputation. They truly believed that because I was the strong one, I would simply absorb the blow and keep their secrets to preserve the family name, never imagining that the rock they leaned on was actually an avalanche waiting to happen. Family is supposed to be a covenant of protection, but as I watched Alyssa toast to her new business partners with my stolen future, I realized that some bonds are meant to be severed with surgical precision. The dinner hadn't even started, but the air was already heavy with the impending collapse of their carefully constructed fantasy, and I was the only one in the room who knew that the sirens were already on their way. As my father rose at the head of the heavy mahogany dining table, his face flushed with the expensive Cabernet Sauvignon he had been pouring all evening, he cleared his throat to deliver a toast to what he called the sacred bond of family loyalty, his gold Rolex Submariner gleaming under the warm glow of the Swarovski chandelier. I didn't wait for him to finish the first sentence. Instead, I stood up with a deliberate metallic click of my heels against the hardwood floor and placed a thick, heavy stack of federal affidavits and CID investigative reports directly onto the lace tablecloth. The room went instantly, chillingly silent, the only sound being the low hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator in the kitchen and the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. I looked my father dead in his eyes, my voice coming out with the cold, calibrated precision of a pre-flight briefing as I told him that I hadn't opened the brown box delivered to my office, but the Criminal Investigation Division certainly had. I began to read the formal charges listed in the documents with a flat, unwavering tone that cut through the perfume-heavy air: multiple counts of identity theft, wire fraud, and the international smuggling of protected cultural antiquities. My mother's hand jerked violently, causing her Waterford crystal wine glass to slip from her fingers and plummet to the floor, where it shattered into 1,000 jagged, glittering shards that looked exactly like the facade of our family's perfect life. The red wine bled into the cream-colored Persian rug, a dark and permanent stain that mirrored the ruin they had brought upon my name, yet I felt no urge to help her or offer a word of comfort. Alyssa, sensing the shift in the room's power dynamic, immediately launched into one of her perfectly rehearsed breathless sobs, her hands trembling as she looked around for the usual wave of sympathy and protection she had enjoyed for 31 years. But for the first time in her life, the room remained frozen. Not even my father moved to hand her a linen tissue or tell her that everything would be all right, as they were all too busy staring at the federal seal on the papers I had laid bare. The technical reality of their crimes was now undeniable, as the affidavits detailed the exact timestamps of the IP logins from their home network and the specific tracking numbers of the Blue Glint logistics shipments they had authorized using my stolen credentials. I watched as the realization dawned on the local socialites at the table, the investors Alyssa had scammed, that they weren't just at a birthday dinner, but were witnesses to a federal crime scene. While ALYSSA cried about her ruined reputation and my mother gasped for air, I thought about the 12 years of 4 a.m. rucks and the hundreds of audits I had performed with perfect honesty, realizing that my strength was no longer a shield for their corruption, but the very weapon that would ensure they faced justice. The air in the room felt thick with the smell of expensive roast beef and the sharp metallic scent of ozone, a sensory overload that signaled the end of my life as their reliable rock. Family is not the blood that flows through your veins, nor is it the shared name on a mailbox in a wealthy neighborhood. Family is the integrity to stand by one another without the presence of a hidden agenda or a forged signature. As I stood there in my crisp Class A uniform, looking at the people who had been willing to send me to a military prison at Leavenworth to fund a boutique apothecary and a gambling habit, I felt a profound sense of detachment. The bond was not just broken. It had been surgically removed, leaving behind a cold, clear space where my loyalty used to live. They had banked on my silence because they believed my love was a weakness, but they had forgotten that a logistics officer knows exactly how to track a debt to its source and demand full payment. As the distant sound of sirens began to wail from the end of the driveway, I didn't feel sadness or regret. I felt the immense, terrifying relief of a woman who has finally set down a weight that was never hers to carry. "You are the strong one, Dana. You have always been the one who could take the hits," my mother shrieked, her voice reaching a jagged, hysterical pitch that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room as she lunged toward me, her manicured nails digging into the wool of my Class A sleeve. "You can handle a reprimand, you have your career and your medals, but ALYSSA is fragile, she would literally die in a place like prison," she whimpered while pointing a trembling finger at my sister, who was currently curled into a ball on the expensive Persian rug, sobbing into her silk sleeves. I looked my mother directly in her watery, desperate eyes, feeling a cold, crystalline layer of indifference settle over my heart, and I responded with a voice that was as flat and final as a closing coffin lid, telling her that if that was the case, then I guessed ALYSSA should start practicing her meditative breathing exercises immediately. Without breaking eye contact, I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform and pulled out a sleek brushed metal Samsung T7 SSD containing the final, undeniable piece of evidence that would bridge the gap between suspicion and a federal conviction. I handed the drive to the lead CID investigator, a grim-faced special agent named Henderson who had been standing by the sideboard, and I informed him that he would find a recorded call from 3 weeks ago, captured by my Tacoma's integrated Bluetooth system during a hands-free sync. On that recording, my father's voice was crystal clear, devoid of its current panicked stutter, as he explained to my brother Marcus that they had specifically chosen to use my name and my military credentials because the Army would never suspect a decorated hero and a logistics expert of being a common smuggler. The silence that followed my statement was heavy, thick with the smell of the now-cold roast beef and the ozone of the impending storm outside, as my father slumped into his mahogany chair, the gold Rolex on his wrist suddenly looking like a shackle rather than a trophy. He didn't even try to deny it. The arrogance that had fueled their 5-year exploitation of my life evaporated in an instant, replaced by the hollow gray look of a man who realized he had finally played his last card and lost everything. I watched as Special Agent Henderson signaled to the uniformed officers waiting in the foyer, the metallic jingle of handcuffs providing a rhythmic accompaniment to the sound of ALYSSA's renewed, high-pitched wailing. While my mother began to scream about betrayal and the sanctity of blood, I stood at rigid attention, my gaze fixed on a point on the wall just above their heads, realizing that I had finally performed the most important audit of my career. I had accounted for every lie, every forged signature, and every cent stolen from my future, and I was finally balancing the books by handing them the consequences they had spent a decade trying to outrun. As they were let out of the house into the drenching Georgia rain, the red and blue lights of the cruisers reflecting off the white columns of the porch like a macabre celebration, I felt a strange, quiet peace settle into my bones. The rock they had relied on hadn't just stood its ground. It had become the very mountain that fell upon them, proving that loyalty is a two-way street that ends abruptly when one side decides to treat the other as a disposable resource. Family isn't the group of people who share your DNA while they plot your downfall from the comfort of a house you unknowingly paid for. Family is the honor you carry within yourself when everyone else has proven to be bankrupt. As the front door finally clicked shut and the house fell into a tomb-like silence, I adjusted my cap, walked out to my old Toyota Tacoma, and drove away from the wreckage of their lives without looking back once. In the end, I realized that some bridges aren't meant to be crossed or even repaired. They are meant to be burned to the ground so that the light from the fire can finally show you the way home. The fallout from my testimony and the digital evidence I provided was as surgical and devastating as a targeted air strike, dismantling their house of cards with a speed that only the federal government can achieve when its own systems have been violated. By 6 o'clock the very next morning, the serene quiet of the Pearl District in Portland was shattered as federal agents raided ALYSSA's art studio, hauling out crates of inventory and the expensive anthropology linens that had been purchased with the blood of my reputation. My parents, who had spent decades meticulously curating an image of upper-middle-class stability in Savannah, were forced to place a massive lien on their brick colonial home to begin covering the staggering $112,000 in initial legal fees, restitution and federal fines. Their golden child, the sister who once spent her afternoons finding her soul on my dime, is now serving 36 months of federal probation and 500 hours of mandatory community service. A sentence that stripped away her ivory tower delusions and replaced them with the harsh reality of a punch clock. She is currently employed as a server at a local Greasy Spoon diner, earning exactly $12 an hour plus tips, a concept of labor she frequently describes as offensive to her artistic sensibilities while she mops floors I once would have paid to keep her off of. Watching the slow-motion collapse of their entitlement from a distance felt like watching a controlled demolition through a long-range optic, detached but intensely focused on the structural integrity of the consequence. My brother Marcus didn't escape the blast radius either, as his shell companies were liquidated and his 2023 BMW M4 was repossessed from his driveway, replaced by the indignity of public transit and a looming trial for his specific role in the forgery. The contrast between our lives has never been more stark, yet for the first time in my 34 years, the weight of their expectations and the gravity of their failures no longer rest on my shoulders. I still wake up at 4 a.m. for my rucks at Fort Peterson, the humid Georgia air feeling lighter now that I am no longer carrying the invisible burden of a family that saw me as a resource rather than a human being. I still drive my silver 2017 Toyota Tacoma, which now has 146,000 miles on it, but the engine runs smoother knowing that the money I save for my future is actually mine to keep. I recently received a frantic collect call from my mother, her voice thin and reedy as she begged me to use my influence to get the charges against my father reduced, but I simply listened to the silence on the line for 10 seconds before hanging up. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from knowing you have done the right thing, even when the right thing feels like setting a forest fire to save the surrounding town. They called me the Rock for years, leaning on me until I cracked, but they failed to realize that when a rock finally breaks, it creates the sharpest edges imaginable. My career is intact, though under the watchful eye of a formal monitoring program for the next year, and Colonel Miller has personally ensured that my record reflects my cooperation as a whistleblower rather than a co-conspirator. Family is not the people who expect you to sacrifice your soul to preserve their comfort. Family is the internal compass that tells you when to walk away from a burning wreck you didn't start. As I stand on the edge of the airfield watching the transport planes take off into the sunrise, I realize that I am finally free of the parasitic cycle that defined my youth. The technical details of their downfall, the bank levies, the revoked passports and the court-mandated employment, are just the math of justice finally being balanced after a decade of theft. I am Dana Whitlow, a logistics officer who finally accounted for her own value, and as I head back to the motor pool to start my day, I know that the only person I have to answer to anymore is the woman looking back at me from the mirror. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as it turns out I am the only one who truly had my own back all along. My promotion to major was delayed by 6 agonizing months while the bureaucratic gears of the Department of Defense ground through the forensic evidence of the investigation, but the final report from the Criminal Investigation Division was so comprehensive that my record is now completely spotless, purged of every shadow they tried to cast upon it. I have taken the final necessary step of blocking every single phone number and digital account associated with the name Whitlow, effectively amputating the gangrenous limb of my past to ensure the health of my future. I spent my actual 35th birthday not in a house filled with lavender-scented lies and expensive, stolen champagne, but in the profound, echoing silence of my new home, a quiet 1,200-square-foot cottage on the outskirts of Savannah that I purchased entirely with my own hard-earned savings. To celebrate, I sat on my modest back deck and poured myself a glass of Lagavulin 16, a $95 bottle of single malt scotch I bought for myself as a symbol of my own sovereignty and the literal price of my freedom. The liquid was smoky and sharp, warming my throat as I watched the fireflies dance over the tall grass, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical glare of the interrogation rooms that had dominated my life only months prior. My rock is not for them to hide behind anymore, nor is it a shield they can hold in front of their own cowardice to deflect the consequences of their greed. Instead, it has become the impenetrable foundation of my own fortress, a life built on the unshakable bedrock of integrity and self-reliance. I have meticulously documented the closing of every joint account and the revocation of every power of attorney they once held over me, ensuring that the technical tethers they used to drain my life have been severed with surgical finality. While ALYSSA is likely scrubbing floors at the diner and my parents are navigating the humiliating maze of bankruptcy court and federal monitoring, I am waking up at 4 a.m. not out of fear or obligation, but out of a disciplined love for the person I have fought so hard to remain. The silver sky metallic Toyota Tacoma is still parked in my driveway, now reaching 150,000 miles, but it feels like a brand new vehicle because it no longer carries the weight of a family that saw my strength as their personal piggy bank. The peace I have found is not the soft, fragile kind that comes from ignorance, but the hard-won, tempered peace of a soldier who has survived a betrayal from within her own ranks and emerged with her honor intact. I look at the gold oak leaf of a major that will soon be pinned to my uniform, and I realize that the delay was a small price to pay for the absolute clarity I have gained regarding what it means to be a person of character. I am no longer the reliable one who absorbs the mistakes of others. I am a commanding officer who knows the exact value of her loyalty and who no longer gives it away for free to those who treat it like a commodity. My cottage, with its simple wooden floors and its lack of expensive forged antiquities, is the first place I have ever lived where the air doesn't feel heavy with unsaid expectations or the looming threat of a secret betrayal. Family is not the people who share your blood and your dinner table while they plan your destruction. Family is the quiet strength you find within yourself when the world tries to break you, and the wisdom to know that some bridges are better left as ash. As I finish my scotch and head inside to prepare my gear for tomorrow's duty, I know that for the first time in my life I am not just a rock for others to lean on. I am the master of my own territory, and the fortress I have built is finally, completely mine. I received a final, desperate email from an unverified burner account at 23:14 on a rainy Thursday, the subject line simply reading family, in a pathetic attempt to trigger a guilt that no longer exists within me. How could you ruin us for a job? The message asked, the words vibrating with the same toxic entitlement that had defined my parents' and ALYSSA's lives for decades as they tried to frame my 12 years of service and sacrifice as nothing more than a careerist's whim. I didn't waste my energy on a long-winded emotional defense or a plea for understanding that would never come. Instead, I simply attached a high-resolution PDF of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the specific sections of the Military Code of Conduct regarding integrity and personal honor. I hit send and ensured I enabled a read receipt, a digital confirmation that would serve as the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. I do not owe them my life, my freedom, or my future just because we happen to share a rare O-negative blood type or a collection of grainy childhood photographs. My loyalty to that name ended the absolute moment they decided to place a $45,000 price tag on my honor and a 20-year prison sentence on my head. The technical finality of that email felt like sealing a pressurized bulkhead, a definitive barrier between the person they tried to exploit and the major I have worked so hard to become. Sitting in my quiet cottage, the only sound being the soft rain against the window pane and the low hum of my laptop, I realized that I had finally completed the ultimate logistical task of my life. I had successfully offloaded 3 decades of emotional baggage and fraudulent expectations. The house they are losing, the black 2024 Volvo that was repossessed, and the $12 an hour shifts ALYSSA is currently enduring are not my failures, but the natural results of their own moral bankruptcy. I looked at the shadow of my silver Toyota Tacoma in the driveway, its high mileage a testament to a journey taken with honesty, and felt a profound sense of pride that I never took the easy route they offered. They thought my strength was a resource to be mined until the vein ran dry, but they failed to account for the fact that a rock doesn't just support weight. It can also be the very thing that crushes the hands of those who try to steal it. There is no more golden child, and no more reliable one in this story, only a set of federal defendants and a United States Army officer who chose her country and her character over a group of predators masquerading as kin. My life is now a sequence of clean audits, early morning runs through the Georgia fog, and the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a woman who has nothing left to hide. Family is a word that carries weight, but I have learned that true weight is only worth carrying when it is shared with respect and built on a foundation of truth. As I closed the lid of my laptop and walked through my small, silent home, I felt the immense relief of knowing that the fortress I have built is finally secure from the enemies within. I am Major Dana Whitlow, and the only legacy I am leaving behind is the one I have earned with my own hands, my own sweat, and my own unbreakable word. I am no longer the shield for their sins. I am the architect of my own peace, and for the first time in 35 years, that is more than enough. Would you like me to continue this story by detailing Dana's first official day as a major and the final legal sentencing of her family? Today, I lead a command of 150 soldiers at Fort Peterson, standing before them in the early morning light as the sun begins to burn through the thick Georgia fog, and I teach them that integrity is not merely what you do when the world is watching. It is the brutal, uncompromising choice you make when your own family asks you to bury a body, figuratively or otherwise. My life has become a living testament to the fact that leadership is not about the rank on your chest but about the depth of the lines you are willing to draw in the sand, even when those lines separate you forever from the people who raised you. I look at these young men and women, many of them barely 20 years old and eager to please, and I tell them that their uniform is not a costume but a skin, one that cannot be shed simply because a sibling or a parent demands a shortcut through the rules. The path to my current position as major was paved with the rubble of my former life, a demolition that was necessary to ensure that the foundation of my command was built on something far more durable than the shifting sands of blood loyalty. Every time I conduct a formal inspection or sign off on a $1 million equipment manifest, I am reminded of the 9:14 a.m. delivery that almost ended everything, and that memory acts as a permanent whetstone for my resolve. My daily existence is now defined by a level of hypervigilance and technical precision that would have suffocated the old Dana, but for the major I have become, it is the only way to breathe. I still drive that silver 2017 Toyota Tacoma, which has now crossed the 155,000-mile mark, and I maintain it with a religious adherence to the manufacturer's service intervals because it represents a time when I was the only thing I could truly rely on. My parents' home in Savannah was sold at a steep loss to satisfy the federal restitution orders, and ALYSSA is currently navigating the third month of a mandatory financial literacy course as part of her probation, a detail I know only because the court-appointed monitor is required to send me quarterly updates. The silence from their side of the family is a gift I gave to myself, a clean break that allows me to focus entirely on the welfare and discipline of the 150 souls currently under my charge. I have become the kind of officer who notices the smallest discrepancy in a fuel log or a missing serial number on a sensitive item, not because I am looking for a reason to punish, but because I know exactly how easily a small crack in the dam can lead to a catastrophic failure of character. The rock they once used as a convenient shield has been forged into something much harder, a cornerstone for a new kind of family, one built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and the absolute certainty that we will never ask each other to compromise our honor. When I stand on the parade deck and look out at the sea of OCP uniforms, I don't see a group of employees. I see a collective of individuals who understand that the price of our freedom is the constant, often painful adherence to the truth. I have chosen my career, my honor, and my peace over the toxic parasitic bond of a family that saw me as a commodity, and I would make that same choice 1,000 times over if it meant standing exactly where I am today. My life is no longer a series of small favors and hidden debts. It is a straight line of accountability that extends from my past directly into a future that I alone have authored. The moral of my story is that family is not who you start with, but who is left standing beside you when the smoke of the truth finally clears the air. As I dismiss my company and head toward the logistics office to begin the day's audits, I do so with the light heart of a woman who finally knows that the only person she ever truly needed to save was herself.